I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, Annette King said that this was a government of Neros because of its fiddling policies as far as social housing is concerned. But I think that it's actually a government of zeros, because that's the number of additional rental houses which its policies and this bill will generate. Zero. Zero. That's the effect of this government's policies. That's the legacy of 7 years of this national government. Zero. That's what it really is. And, Mr Speaker, this bill is a monument to this government's appalling record on housing. When I entered this House first in 2011, there was already a very significant housing shortage, especially in Auckland. And of course, in that very same year, we had the Christchurch earthquakes, and that created another housing crisis there. But even then, the government was saying there is no housing crisis. However, it got worse, and it got worse, and it got worse until we get to the point where nobody with half a brain could deny that we have the most serious housing crisis in this country's history. And yet this government still fiddles and still produces zeros as far as increased houses for people who need to rent them from the state are concerned. And, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First would support sensible policies which provide more efficient services, better services at less cost, but never at the expense of people who are being forced out of their homes. And that is effectively what this legislation and the Principal Act, which it amends, does. What this government seeks to do is to minimise the role of the state, abdicate responsibility to others, provide as little money as possible for housing, contract others to take responsibility instead, push as many people out of state houses as possible, favour non-government organisations, many of whom are simply not capable of fulfilling this function, pretend that public services are being provided at less cost, avoid full accountability for social housing, and lastly, to fail to protect people against exploding rents. That's the record of this government, and that's why I say that this bill is a monument to its appalling record on housing. Now, if you look at some of the housing providers, the best ones in the community, one of the best is the Salvation Army, and it is an NGO which could be relied upon to be a good provider. However, it looked at the government's policies, it looked at what the government was trying to do, and it stepped back and said, we're not going to be a part of that. To their credit, Mr Speaker, to their credit. And that actually is a sound commentary from an independent source on what really this government's housing record and its legislation on social housing in particular is. Mr Speaker, the main thrust of what the government is trying to do is actually to reduce the size of the state, and in particular in this case to reduce the role of Housing New Zealand. It couldn't be more clearly spelled out than we see in this amendment bill. It's a further step in the wrong direction. By preventing Housing New Zealand from giving advice to ministers, it is sidelining an important role for Housing New Zealand, a role which has performed very well over a very long time. It's a mistake to do that. Instead, MB will be given that responsibility, but actually it's only going to be a contract supervisor with a limited role and no real responsibility. The result will be that far too much institutional knowledge will be lost, and ministers will be empowered to give directions. And there's a deliberate move towards what is called flexibility. But none of the speakers opposite, even though they've used the word a lot, have told us what that really means. What I think it means is that ministers will be able to exercise their own agenda, and that's why they're being given the power to give directions. This is not a good way to conduct and administer housing policy in this country. If that member opposite cannot understand what I'm trying to say, then that's an indictment on him, not on what I've said, and he doesn't understand this bill. I doubt that he's even read it, and he certainly doesn't want to take responsibility for some of the worst government policy that this government has brought forward in this term or the last one. So I recommend that that member actually reads the bill, and when he speaks next, perhaps he'll try to say something sensible. Mr. Speaker, the results of this government's policy will be that social housing will be delivered at very great arm's length from the government's agencies, and more power will be given to ministers, another example of an increase in executive power. And that's likely to mean a very political approach. It's likely to mean a very dogmatic approach, not one aimed at looking at the best interests of the most vulnerable people in this country, despite what those opposite have been saying. It will in fact have the opposite effect. It will mean those people will be worse off, have less housing choices, and they will certainly not meet the housing need for people who need to rent homes in this country. It ultimately means more housing deprivation, state houses even harder to get, non-government providers imposing their own policies and practices, and goodness knows what they will be, and most of all, a very uncertain outcome for low-income people, many of whom will be pushed out of state houses with nowhere really to go, and that is a very poor legacy and a very poor outcome. The price of suppressing demand, which is what this government is really trying to do, is very high in social terms. It will cause reduced health and well-being, increased poverty, more families at risk, compromised social cohesion, and an exacerbation of the already bad enough disaffected underclass of people in New Zealand. Despite the government's claims, people will inevitably be bullied out of their state houses, and the government will continue to sell state houses. Goodness knows how that will improve the situation for people who need to rent homes in New Zealand. And the government will build far too few state houses, and that is the fundamentally bad part of the government's program, because there is no money really set aside in this budget to improve that situation. This government is simply unwilling to invest and to ensure that there are enough houses for people to rent in New Zealand. It's another step in the wrong direction. Mr. Speaker, the government will pay huge sums of money to community housing organisations through contracts which are supposed to be tailored contracts. Now, what does this term tailored mean? Again, nobody opposite has really described what that means. What I think it means is that some organisations will be treated differently than others. And what's the effect of that, and what's the reason for that? We haven't been told. We don't really know what this amendment will do as far as these so-called tailored contracts are concerned. Let's hear an explanation from the Minister, because so far she hasn't given one. Mr. Speaker, these are still just subsidies to registered providers. Call it what you like, that's actually what they are. These organisations will own the housing funded by the taxpayer, they will profit from it, they will compete for it, and they will try to get the highest rents they can for them. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a retrograde step. It emasculates Housing New Zealand. It seeks to reduce government accountability. It increases executive power. It does nothing to reduce rents. It does nothing to increase the rental housing stock in New Zealand. And New Zealand First will certainly vote against it.
I call Stuart Smith.
Thank you,